to give a little bit of background to the pilots before we move on to hearing from the people who actually did the work. So, a little bit of context for the open research indicator pilots. There is, of course, program context in which they are planned. And that is that the program was intending to promote institutional change, as I say, towards accelerating the uptake of high quality open research practices, and doing so in a number of different ways by promoting skills through a train the trainer program, changing the incentive structures through working with institutions to reform the ways in which they reward and recognize their staff in recruitment and promotion and appraisal practices, through changing institutional norms and behaviours to encourage institutions to share practice and adopt practice from elsewhere, and to enable them to adopt more evidence-informed continual improvement cycles through the provision of dashboards, reporting tools, and those sorts of things. So you can see where open research indicators might fit into that, into the latter, the last of those points. But of course, as a programme as a whole, we had an interest in evaluating whether or not the programme's interventions had the sorts of effects and outcomes that we were hoping for. So at that level as well, we were interested in what sorts of indicators might be possible for us to use. So the kinds of approaches that we have been looking at include evaluation of each of those particular projects, the Train the Trainer project, the incentives project, and so on. But at the program level also a survey, because surveys are a very good way of getting at particular kinds of information. And we've adopted a standard validated questionnaire instrument and using a representative sample to try to avoid self-selection bias in that. But and I'm sure we'll be talking about the survey on another UKRN webinar at some point. But today we're talking about the potential for automated indicators. So these are indicators of open research practices that might arise from research information systems. And the hypothesis we were testing, I guess, was that these information systems had now developed to a sufficient level of maturity that those indicators could be derived and they would be sufficiently valid and reliable and ethical and practical to be used for both planning and evaluating interventions to support open research. Just to be clear, these aren't indicators that we're talking about today that should be around assessing or evaluating individual researchers. They're not part of the world that Dora and Coara, for example, are very concerned with around researcher assessment. These are the sorts of indicators that institutions use as organizations to target support and evaluate the effect of interventions at an aggregate level. There is a wider context, of course. The UKRN programme is operating in a wider context, and one way of thinking about that is the UNESCO recommendation on open science that came out a couple of years ago, a very broad definition of open science, and being a UNESCO recommendation, it has the sort of commitment from UNESCO member countries, 180 something of them, including the United Kingdom. And it means that UNESCO has an interest in monitoring the implementation of this recommendation over time among those 180 countries, and that has spawned a number of initiatives, including the Open Science Monitoring Initiative, in which UKRN, among many, many other organisations around the world, are playing a part. But of course, this is not new. Lots of organisations and initiatives have been running programs and projects for a long time around monitoring open research. Here are just three. The Curtin Open Knowledge Initiatives based in Australia, the German Berlin Institutes of Health, the Charité Hospital, and the Centre for Open Science in the United States, all of whom are actively developing and using open research indicators of various kinds. And the list of those initiatives could be much longer than that. And one of the things that the Centre for Open Science is doing in particular is developing a global alliance for meta research, and perhaps in particular focus for today, meta research around open science. And that's sort of important because one of the other initiatives that came on the scene while we were running these pilots was the Barcelona Declaration on Open Research Information. And clearly, if meta research is going to have the features that we look for in high quality research, that is rigor and transparency and open research, then the data, methods, algorithms on which that meta research is based should be open and transparent, hence the relevance of the Barcelona Declaration on Open Research Information. But even further back than that, and even broader in some ways, the work that we're doing here is, or at least can be seen as part of a much wider set of academic activities and literatures around scientometrics, science and technology studies, science studies, sociology of science, higher education policy studies, and so on. So there's an extremely broad and long history of research on research in various forms. And here are two of the conferences that are going on this year, which I very much hope I will see many of you at, both in June, July, and in September in Bristol. And although you can't see it because it's behind my head, there is now a global initiative looking at research on research, specifically with respect to open science, and that's being led out of the French Ministry for Science. So lots going on, of which we hope that the pilots that we've been running through the UK Reproducibility Network will make a small but noticeable contribution. And so here's a little outline of the timeline. We started a couple of years ago now with a prioritization exercise where we asked the UK higher education sector and those working in it to let us know which aspects of open research they were most keen to monitor. And we excluded open access from that prioritization exercise and came up with a list, broadly speaking, of four main topics. So these are fair data and open data, the effects of sharing data, the use of the credit taxonomy to recognize contributions to research, and pre-registration. And those are the themes that we'll come back to and talk about later on in this webinar. There was quite a protracted period of time where we refined the teams and the topics. So who was going to work with whom on what? We had a lot of interest from UK institutions, between 15 and 20 initially, came down to I think a list of around 14 in the end, institutions who wanted to be involved in this, and a much wider list of solutions partners than were eventually involved for various reasons that I'll come back to. The solutions partners were included both commercial and open providers, data infrastructures, indicator providers of various kinds. And so there was discussion, refinement, negotiation of teams and topics, who was going to work on what, and then a period of setup during 2023-2024, where we set up ways of working, arrangements, and partnership principles and things like that to try to give some guardrails to the pilots. The next step was that most of the pilots generated some input data from the participating institutions. So these were typically lists of research publications that represented research outputs from those institutions over a period of time that would act as input data, and that would then be part of how those pilots worked with the solutions partners, who then used their expertise, their data sets and algorithms to generate indicators or candidate indicators for the particular aspects of open research that the pilot was interested in monitoring. Once those came back, most of the pilots conducted manual checks where they took a subset of that initial list and had a look with human eyes at whether or not they would have counted the particular aspects of open research as being present, and compared that with what the automated indicators, the automated checks found, and run a comparison using a reasonably standard method for doing that. And that was all part of the outcomes and findings from the pilots. We're now at the write-up and sharing phase, and this webinar is part of that. And the next steps, we originally thought that, we hoped that the next steps would be that we would identify a set of indicators that could be rolled out to the partner institutions in the open research program, We may or may not be able to do that. We will find out later on in this webinar what the findings of those pilots has been. But certainly there are going to be other kinds of next steps. And for example, you could break down the aims, if you like, and this is perhaps a little bit retrospective, the aims of the pilots to see what can be monitored well enough now and how best to do that. And so the kinds of recommendations we might be able to make to participating institutions in the programme and more widely about if you want to monitor this aspect of open research and you want to use automated indicators to do that, here's how best to do that now. But secondly, to identify what needs to be done across the system, and it is a system, to improve the ways in which those aspects of open research can be monitored. And those recommendations are likely to fall on institutions and researchers and publishers and funders and many others to improve the ways in which open research prevalence can be monitored. A few other reflections from me initially before we crack on into the detail of the pilots. It's worth noting that there was no funding for these pilots specifically. Nobody was paid to be involved. It was relying on really quite Herculean voluntary efforts by all concerned. But that did have consequences. It did mean, for example, that we were exclusionary, that small institutions, perhaps smaller initiatives from the indicator producers world were not able to participate. They simply didn't have the resources needed to be part of sort of longer term thinking around and piloting around open research indicators. And that is something that we've reflected on and blogged about, and something that we need to address through engaging through webinars like this and in other ways to make sure that the findings that we're coming up with are not therefore biased towards those who were able to participate. The voluntary side of things also meant that there were frankly unreasonable demands to be made on all participants, and I'm just extraordinarily grateful to them for accommodating those demands. And it did inevitably mean that there have been delays in the pilots, and that's happened at various points in all of the 6 pilots. But there was a huge amount of goodwill and willingness to share. I was gratified, not surprised necessarily, because I think everybody entered into this in good faith, but that maintained throughout the pilots. There was a lot of goodwill. We were sharing within limits, of course, so some of the solutions partners were commercial operations and they have limits in what they couldn't reasonably be asked to share in terms of algorithms and sort of detailed methodologies that they might use to inform product development. But also institutions had concerns about some kinds of sharing, about, for example, the risks that might be inherent with respect to unreasonable comparisons between institutions, for example. And finally, just a note that there were ways in which the pilots could have been better managed, and that falls on me. And one example might be that they could have been sequenced at the moment, that as they all ran at the same time. A little sequencing would have very much helped, I think, as some were logically prior to others. So these are the people I want to thank, and just an amazing and very large group of people. And if your name isn't here and should be, I apologize. But you can see a very large group of institutions, a good range of solutions partners, and all of the names of the people who have been involved. So thank you very much to everyone here. So now I'm going to propose that I hand over to the people who really did the work, so you can hear what you really want to hear about the pilots. Because this is a recording, I'm going to suggest that I hand over now to Mick to talk about data availability statements. Mick then hands directly over to Jenni to talk about indicators of fair data, and on to Kirsty around open data, then on to Etienne for the downstream effects of sharing data, to Mark for free registration, and then finally to Amanda for the credit taxonomy and the indicators of that. We'll then, at some point during that, we will pause for a break. We'll see how that goes in terms of timing, and then we will come back and have some questions from you, I hope, and discussion around what the next steps might be. Okay, thanks very much, and over to you, Mick.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Nicola, for screen sharing on behalf of Neil. I believe we're going with slightly a different running order. If the speakers are still okay to stick with Mark speaking next. I believe that's what we agreed, but if you'd like to change that, let me know. But we have 3 speakers who will speak before the break for roughly 10 minutes each. So thanks, Neil, and I'll hand over now to Mark Kelson from the University of Exeter.
Okay, I think I should be sharing screen now.
Yeah,
And
that's all
I
good.
am in presenter mode and I can still see some people, so hopefully that's all fine. Yes, so as you might expect, we're starting with pilot 6 on pre-registration. And so I'm here representing the group of people who were involved in this. And this pilot, I'm going to keep it fairly brief and pithy. But this is it was co-led by Exeter, Manchester, and Leeds, and we ended up working with 3 solutions partners: Open Air Dimensions and PLOS DataSeer. There are other names who contributed. This was the core group, so these are the people who were on the weekly meetings that we had for basically the past year and a half. And a huge thanks is due to all of these people. Okay, so I'll move us on. Our project plan. So we had this iNorms scoping document, which everyone on all the pilots is familiar with, and all the partner institutions were asked about what their priorities were for their institution, and that was collated, and we came up with a plan for what we should do for pre-registration. And this was our plan. We wanted a literature review. We wanted to build a data set of institutional outputs, then to identify how to search for pre-reg manually. This is like the manual check that Neil was talking about. Identify a subset of those outputs that we would do our manual check on. So we envisaged that we would have the automated systems look at a large amount of outputs from an institution, and then the humans would check a sample, maybe 10%, something like that. And then we were going to summarize those institutional outputs and compare against the human rating. So we had 3. We initially planned that we would have 5, but we didn't collaborate extensively with the Centre for Open Science or with OpenAlex. The Centre for Open Science, the idea there was that we could identify the pre-registered studies first and then look for subsequent outputs. Whereas we decided that it was a bit easier and more logical to start with the output and identify whether it was pre-registered. So I think we felt that it was easier to do it that way around. So the Centre for Open Science, which has a large repository of prospective pre-registrations, we felt it was better to go the other way in the system. OpenAlex, I can't quite remember what happened, but I don't know that we had lots of discussions with OpenAlex. I think, as a pilot, we're pretty ruthless about maintaining on brief. We wanted to look at the prevalence of pre-registration, and that is the extent of what we did. We kind of wanted a number at the end. What is the prevalence for an institution, maybe for a discipline, maybe for a department, but that's it. Pre-registered, yes, no. We weren't tolerating maybes, and we weren't kind of, we didn't want any mission creep. And I think we did a very good job on that, maybe to the extent of excluding some things that might have been interesting and we would want to incorporate in a future pilot. We pre-registered the work as best as we could, and it is available there. So we started off with this pilot. We started off to operationalize pre-registration as evidence of a study plan being publicly published and time-stamped in advance of that study plan being enacted. And I think as we went through, we found 3 different components to this. Oh, hang on. Next one. So the 3 different components. There's a pre-part to pre-registration. So the registration should occur before the work takes place. There's an open bit. This is the public bit. People should be able to check that what we're saying, what somebody's saying is available. And then there's the registration part. The description should match what actually happened. So what was pre-specified should match the output. So if any one of these 3 is missing, I think the spirit of pre-registration has been lost in an important way. Now, as we started through this pilot, we really focused on the middle one, the openness of pre-registration. We relied heavily on self-report for the fact that the registration happened before the work takes place. And we relied on self-report for the registration matching what was actually published. And I do think that those are two important components of pre-registration that our pilot was not able to address. So further work is required for those two. And I'll say a little bit more about the registration part later. But for the pre part, I think this is an extremely challenging component, because you could pre-register some work and timestamp it, and then submit your published article. You then submit your manuscript, and it's difficult to know when the work happened. You're still relying on self-report, the manuscript saying this was when the work happened and the pre-registration happened beforehand. And so there's always going to be a component of self-report. Okay, so this is a slide just because I have this image in my presentation illustration box that I wanted to use for a long time. My view is that this worked really well. We had 3 solution partners. Everyone was incredibly collegiate. There was more sharing and more openness to identifying ways to improve than I thought was going to be possible to begin with. And I thought it was we had really good weekly meetings where everyone was really collegiate. The solutions partners were learning from each other. The research institutions were all contributing really, really well. And I thought that was one component, given, as Neil said, that there was no funding associated with this work. So the methods, so we had 3 solutions partners, OpenAir, Dimensions, and PLOS. OpenAir employed a systematic text mining methodology. Dimensions, it was basically targeted search strings, but there's more to it than that. There's loops, and there's misspellings and incorporating certain other aspects. Lots of these details would be available in our final report. The PLOS data seer approach is, I think it's on version 7 now. That's the link for version 7. It's involved, but there's a lot of write-up on that. And so all of these, the takeaway from this slide is that there was 3 different approaches which we wanted to make sure would be open to everybody, so not on proprietary platforms. So it would be possible to implement these strategies for your institution organization, and three different approaches. Okay, and these are the results that we found. Overall, about 38% of the outputs that we searched, these are outputs from the institutions that were from 2023, published in 2023, from Leeds, Exeter, and Manchester. And we found about 38% of them were pre-registered. You can see here the final column. This is the human rating. So the humans rated, each of these rows is an output. So OpenAir assessed this one, PLOS assessed the same one, Digital Science assessed the same one. This is the intersection of all the papers. And the humans rated these as mostly being not pre-registered. About 60% are not pre-registered. And you can see there's broad agreement. These lines, these rows are all basically the same color, with some exceptions. And you can see there's a trade-off between sensitivity and specificity, exactly as you would expect. But the overall accuracy, there's not a huge amount to choose between any of these 3 approaches, in my view. You would get slightly different answers if you took a slightly different subset. I think in the end, we had just over 100 outputs that were manually checked. So that was, I think it's 112 or 113, something like that. And yeah, I mean, the sensitivity is quite high for lots of these. There's a balance between specificity, but broadly speaking, this was achievable to identify in an automated fashion from the outputs themselves whether the work was pre-registered or not. Okay, I've got 2 slides of reflections which I would like to spend just a little bit of time on, and I don't know whether we're going to do questions immediately afterwards or whether we'll move straight on to the next one. One of the things that might seem obvious, but was something that transpired, that we realized as we were going through the study. First of all, not every institution has a complete set of the outputs from that institution. Institutions often rely on individual academics uploading their work, and if they fail to do that, then the institution, the university, doesn't have a complete set of outputs. And often those universities will augment their repositories with external indexes. So they'll look in other platforms and identify papers that they think they should have in their repository and import those. But that was surprising to me, that an institution wouldn't have a complete enumeration about everything. It makes sense. You are relying on individuals, and these people sometimes forget. As a result, choosing a platform that indexes lots of outputs is important. So if you're trying to identify the prevalence of pre-registration for your institution, then you should check to see how much of your institution's output is indexed in that repository. That's the first thing you should do. It should have almost all of your outputs if you're going to get a good estimate of prevalence. My view is that all of the methods performed largely similarly. I think all three of these will learn from each other, and they'll all sort of coalesce to a slightly higher overall accuracy, sensitivity, but they're all, broadly speaking, pretty good compared to human checking. I would also caveat that the human checking was a dual rating system, which I think is not without flaws. So, it's possible that the gold standard of the human check was the one that was incorrect, and so that would involve doing further checks, maybe a triple human check, or going back and identifying the snippet that led the automated algorithm to believe the work was pre-registered. And the final one on this slide is a big one, the pre part. As I mentioned before, I think it is challenging to know that the pre-registration happened before the work happened, and you are relying on people, just being honest, and that there is time stamping on lots of these platforms for pre-registration, but that doesn't mean that you can't just retrospectively pre-register something and then say the work happened at a later date. Okay, second set of reflections. The quality of the registration we did not check. And so it's really critical, right? So, I mean, if somebody says we pre-registered, and then you go and it's a pre-registration for a different study, an automated system is not actually going further and checking that the pre-registration matches the current output. And we did notice examples of cuckoo registration. And so I'm from a clinical trials background, and I know that lots of clinical trials will be pre-registered, and lots of clinical trials will have associated qualitative studies, maybe process evaluations, or eliciting the opinions of participants in a trial. And sometimes those qualitative explorations are not as pre-registered as the quantitative components. And we definitely saw some research which cited a clinical trial registration and said the work was pre-registered, but the output itself was not referred to in the pre-registration of the trial. And so the idea being, this is a cuckoo registration. A paper is piggybacking on a genuine pre-registration, but is doing something that was not pre-specified in the pre-reg. Another final reflection: the prevalence of pre-registration is discipline specific. And so this really shouldn't be feeding into institutional level comparisons. Take, for example, an institution that has lots of departments that don't do a lot of pre-reg. So I'm thinking social sciences or the humanities. There's much less scope for pre-registration in some of those fields. And if you were just calculating the prevalence and comparing institutions and saying one institution is doing better at pre-reg than another, then that's not a fair comparison. You should be comparing biomedical sciences to biomedical sciences. And even then you might have questions about it. I'm thinking in the current academic climate, where entire departments and disciplines are facing cuts, I could easily envisage a situation where an institution makes people redundant, and that might lead to an increase in their prevalence of pre-registration just because certain disciplines are being targeted. And that would worry me if an indicator like this was being used in that way. We came across lots of work where pre-registration is not applicable. If you're deriving a mathematical theorem, it's very difficult to pre-register your mathematical exploration of an esoteric topic. And so it's not applicable or appropriate to pre-register that kind of exploratory or exploration research. There's lots of other areas of science where pre-registration is not appropriate. And again, when you're estimating a prevalence, you really should be filtering out the not applicables because they shouldn't count towards your denominator. And my view is that is a challenging question because experts will disagree on which outputs are eligible for pre-registration. I think everyone agrees a clinical trial that's recruiting human participants, that's got to be pre-registered. Everyone agrees that a study of art history novels doesn't need to be pre-registered. But in the middle, there's a whole gray area of stuff that people will disagree on. So final message. My view, automated identification of self-reported pre-registration is currently achievable. I think you can get pretty good accuracy and you could save yourself a lot of time using an automated approach. But much more work potentially needs to be done to assess temporal and quality components. And those are also key components of any efforts to estimate pre-registration. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now and hope that you're all still there. I think I'm handing over to Jenni unless there are...
Thanks, Mark. Dolly, I think you wanted to take questions all at the end, is that right? Yeah, grand. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. And apologies, I do have a horrible cold. I'm going to try not to make too many disgusting noises, but you may need to excuse me. Okay, so I'm talking about pilot 1, which was assessing the fairness of data. And just to give a shout out to everybody that was involved, this was co-led between Sheffield and Edinburgh. So Edinburgh, Kerry Miller and Jill Curry were my co-leads. And we had contributions from a range of institutions, including Bristol, Exeter, Glasgow, Liverpool, Reading and Surrey. And it would not have been possible without the contribution of all involved. Okay, so what were we trying to achieve in this pilot? The aim was to explore the possibility of developing indicators to measure the fairness of data underpinning research publications. So where there is a publication, if there is underpinning data, is that data being shared in a way that is fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable? So essentially, is it being shared in the best way, a way that kind of maximizes the onward value of that data? So as with the other pilots, we began with an in-norm scope framework reflection exercise. And the research behaviours that we identified as being particularly important for this pilot were, in particular, sharing data in ways that best facilitate access and reuse, and also providing metadata for discoverability, including for closed data. So not just for open data sets, but also the documentation of data in a metadata-only record, for example. And we decided to start with publications rather than repositories. So essentially, there are 2 ways that we imagined approaching this. One of which would have been to go straight to data and repositories and try to examine how well that data had been shared, how many of the FAIR principles or which of the FAIR principles were essentially met by that data. But we decided that to do that would kind of bypass the question of the findability of the data altogether. And it would essentially be only looking at positive cases where data had been shared in repositories. So we wanted to start one step prior to that with publications, looking at publications and seeing where data sets referred to, if they were referred to, how many of the FAIR principles and in what way did they fulfill those principles as a published data set. Okay, so in order to achieve this, we've got the in-norm scope exercise and the literature review, which we conducted in a similar way to Mark's project. So these both fed into the identification of sub-indicators that were of particular interest to the pilot study. Obviously, there are many, many sub-indicators of fairness, and we couldn't focus on them all. But we identified a set that were of particular interest. And in doing so, we found that the FAIR's FAIR data object assessment metrics were particularly useful, not just in kind of delineating and articulating those, but also in highlighting what were the component questions that would need to be answered in order to say and to kind of verify, for example, that dataset metadata includes provenance information. So as part of this literature review and the scope exercise and the kind of discussions that emerged from that, we identified this set in blue. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but this set in blue in the middle of sub-indicators. So these include things like dataset has a persistent identifier, metadata contain the access level and access conditions of the data. Dataset metadata includes reuse license. So we were choosing things that we felt were particularly indicatory of a level of good practice in fair data. And as you can see by the FAIR, we tried to select a kind of group of sub-indicators of interest that represented a spread across findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. So once we had identified those, we developed a pilot specification that we shared with the external providers. So together with the specification, which was essentially a kind of detailing of the approach, what we were coming from, what we were particularly interested in, and what would need to be proven in order to verify that those criteria had been met. We also created a shared data set containing details of the outputs from various institutions. And this was for the solutions providers to kind of play with and test and see what they could add to it in terms of data that gave information about these identified sub-indicators and whether they had been met. So we shared the specification and the test data set with the providers, who were Digital Science, Elsevier, OpenAir and PLOS Dataseer, and had some back and forth discussions. And then the providers went on to develop the sub-indicators. And what this took the form of, for the most part, was taking the data that we had provided and developing various methods, whether algorithmic or large language model related, to add extra columns to this that included the data that answered some of the questions that were relating to those particular sub-indicators. So the providers returned the test data sets to the institutional partners. Excuse me a minute. And then that's when we engaged in that manual testing procedure, where a sample of the records were checked to establish, whether the providers had said that condition had been met, and then whether, as a kind of human manual check, we identified that had indeed been met. So, to get to the findings, between all of the 4 providers, data was returned that was relevant to at least the following. So dataset has a PID, a persistent identifier. Dataset metadata includes creator, title, data identifier, etc. What we call the full metadata set or basic minimal metadata set. Dataset metadata specify access level and conditions. Is this open data? Is it restricted? If it's restricted, are there details of how to access it? Dataset metadata includes provenance information, so things like date of creation, who created it, and so on. And dataset metadata includes license. So these are of those kind of big wish list, these are the ones where it seemed most possible to provide relevant data using the various methods identified by the providers. In addition to, was data generated in the study, and this one was particularly valuable because, as Mark was talking, we need a denominator for these measures that allows us to judge only those that should be judged as to whether the data is fair. So if no data was collected in a study, for example, it's not fair to regard that as one that has performed poorly against having fair data. So whether or not the data was generated in a study is an important thing to be able to deliver information on, to calculate that relevant and not unfair evaluation. So these are the items that were identified as most possible among the data that was returned by providers, but there are various caveats and limitations. And these mean that it wasn't possible to develop functioning indicators in the kind that perhaps we hoped we might be able to at the outset, but still some useful and relevant information. I'm just going to briefly go into those caveats and limitations. So there was some uneven accuracy in some of the data that was returned, some issues with the cleanness of the data that was returned. The evaluation and analysis process that we used was itself not perfect. So it involved us doing a manual check. Is that feature present? and the provider's data has indicated whether they think the future's present, but we're not necessarily looking at the same things. The data from the provider could be incorrect in saying this isn't here, or it could be looking at something and misreading that thing, but the thing is actually there, but it's somewhere else, and we're saying yes, it is. So there were kind of issues in that where we thought this is not a perfect process. In one instance, there was a lack of negative results. So the provider had were only able to share with us data where they had identified an underlying data set for that output, which then perhaps led to a lack of balance in the data as we were able to assess it. Also, the question of a lack of one-to-one mapping between our schools' data sets and licenses. So I think this parallels Mark's pilot's experience of kind of getting into the weeds of this issue and actually it turning out to be a little bit more complicated than you'd initially, I guess, grasped it to be. So, for example, what do we do where there is an article where there are 5 underlying data sets and one of them has a persistent identifier and the others are somewhere less appropriate, for example? How do we assess that? Is it 1/5 fair, but we're trying to give a yes or no for that particular indicator? Additional steps were needed to create the indicator. So those included having a clearly defined and accurately reported denominator, but also things like converting that raw data of here are all the metadata fields that we found into is there a complete metadata set or not, for example. And the greater transparency was needed of the steps to create the indicators. So in order to have a method that could be reproduced, we would need to have further insight into those sometimes obscure processes that were part of the provider's methodologies and that perhaps sometimes for commercial reasons could not necessarily be clarified fully. Okay, so we don't have working indicators as a result of that, but we think that we have achieved some valuable preliminary work and that the mapping that we've done in our reporting will be able to be of use to further efforts in this area. And then lastly, we made a few recommendations that just emerged from observations during this process. So the need for dialogue with journals and publishers to advocate for good quality standardized article metadata, because this was lacking. The need for dialogue with repositories to advocate for inclusion of a full range of metadata fields and if possible to mandate completion of those at submission of a data set. And then engaging with researchers in terms of how to include a clear data availability statement. Things that seem obvious but clearly weren't obvious, like when referring to available data in a DAS, giving a PID where that one's available rather than just, for example, a web URL, which is not necessarily persistent over time, and checking that the PIDs that they're giving are correct and resolve, and also avoiding data available on request, or if that does need to be used, explaining why and how to request access. So I would say we didn't perhaps get exactly what we were hoping for from the pilot, but we produced a lot of really interesting data that I think will be of value to further efforts in this area. I think that's my last slide. Yep, so I'm going to hand over now to Jade, who I think is Etienne's pointing at himself. Is it you, Etienne? I thought it was Jade. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, I thought I was next as well.
I think we're working on a couple of different running orders, but I think in the one we agreed it was Jade next. Yeah.
Okay, I will. I'll just share my screen now. Bear with me. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. Yes. No. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Jade. So I'm part of the research data service at the University of Bristol. So alongside my colleagues, Kirsty Merritt and Christopher Warren, we were the leads for the Pilot 2 openness of data. So firstly, if that slide moves, there we go. Firstly, I just wanted to thank everyone who was involved. So we had participating institutions of Edinburgh, Exeter, Glasgow, Leicester, Liverpool, Reading, and Sheffield and Surrey. And we also worked with solution providers, Digital Science, Elsevier, PLOS DataSeer, and OpenAir. So the aim of Pilot 2 then was to co-create a transparent, ethical, and accurate indicator to define the degree of openness of cited data with standardized terminology, and also measure and identify the degree of openness of that cited data. So like the other pilots, we use the in-norm scope framework to identify the key considerations across participating institutions, who I've just mentioned just now. So the themes that we identified were assessing current data openness and compliance. So that included gauging data availability on a spectrum from fully open with licenses to restricted access. Also evaluating compliance with data sharing policies from funders, institutions, and publishers. Also tracking license usage, so especially open licenses like CCO, CC BY versus conditional ones. We also wanted to identify patterns and barriers of researchers who frequently did or did not share data openly. We also wanted to promote open practices that supported cultural change and encouraged openness through incentives like incorporating it into promotional criteria, and also embed and align best practices such as integration of open data practices among staff and students to align with kind of sector and institutional standards, but also collaborating with larger groups to develop shared vocabulary and a universal monitoring framework. So what do we mean by the openness of data? I'm sure everyone in this call already knows, but we're going to go through it. So open data is already a widely understood and defined term that means that data can be freely used, modified, and shared by anyone for any purpose. The concept of openness then comes from that kind of guiding principle that research data should be shared as open as possible and as close as necessary. So as it says in the UNESCO recommendations of open science affords necessary protections for sensitive data, information, sources, and subject of study. So the degree of openness then, we're not seen as a hierarchical structure, as those external factors then, such as ethical and commercial sensitivities, should be factored into appropriate access levels for data sharing. So the approach that we're taking is sort of viewing data openness on a spectrum or sliding scales from fully open and freely accessible to data that cannot be shared. So for the purpose of this pilot, institutional leads and partners agreed on the following definitions for the degree of openness. I will very quickly run through them. So as we mentioned before, open data, which is freely available for reuse, technically open data, that was the same as above, but with registration. Embargo data, likewise, same as above, but with an embargo period. Then we had control data, which was available on request through standard data sharing agreement process. Author control data, which is available on request through contacting the author directly. Closed data, which was data existing in a repository but not available to be shared. And dark data, which exists outside of a repository and cannot be shared or linked to. So those definitions are originated at the University of Glasgow. So many thanks to their research information management for inputting them into this pilot, and for everyone who was involved in the pilot for agreeing that we didn't need to reinvent the wheel. So to measure openness then, we needed to find the data sets. I know Jenni just spoke about this as well, but we agreed then we'd use the data availability statement as that central point of analysis. So from our point of view, this was due to kind of limited internal linkage between institutional repositories and also the kind of capabilities of the solution provider tools. So in initial discussions, it was only mentioned that I think one or two solution providers could actually kind of scrape data exactly from the research data repositories, and also there was issues with sort of commercial and usage there. So it was sort of limited to what providers could access, and then also we were impacted by kind of the constraints of the current academic publishing market. So that were favors then sort of publication of research articles over individual data sets. So due to the kind of correlation between the pilots dealing with fairness of data and also prevalence and quality of data availability statements, which is pilots 1 and 4, I believe, we agreed to work together. So each institution provided a data set using mandatory fields and an agreed criteria of open access research articles published in 2023. So in addition to sort of standardizing the data input, we felt this meant the solution providers could take a staggered approach. So identifying the DAS first, then evaluating the completeness and quality of that, and then finally seeing how fair and open that cited data was. In addition then, so solution providers were asked to measure the following criteria to produce analysis of pilot 2 results. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read all these out, but they range from what we thought could be possible. So identifying the location of data, is it in a repository, is it in supplementary material, things like that. If there is a persistent identifier, what the openness type was based on the glossary that we provided, and then also what the license was, and then also kind of ideal world scenarios such as like the appropriateness, the data set itself for the article. So what happened? So only 3 of the 4 solution providers returned the data. That was just due to timelines and resources. As it was mentioned at the start, this was voluntary for both sides. So some timelines just didn't work out. Also, there was issues like across the board with like data cleaning, corruption, and being able to accurately categorize data. For our pilot, only 2 to 3 of our 12 specifications were met, but I really do think that was because of the overlapping between the pilot specifications, especially in our case with the fairness of data. There was a lot of things that we included in our specifications, which pilot 1 did as well, which I know they got responses back on like file types and licenses, whereas we didn't. So I think that was just, again, a miscommunication and a problem with the fact that all these pilots are running at the same time. Only 1 of the return data set used our definitions for openness. So all the other providers used their own terminology, which didn't necessarily kind of include that sort of vast degree of openness that we kind of wanted to try and track. So some of it was just like closed or open, another was just in supplementary material, in repository, request from author, or not applicable. Also, they all access the openness of the data availability statement rather than the data itself. One provider did check that the live status of the DOI, so we had like a kind of if they could get through to it or not. But again, the kind of overall openness assessment that we had was based on what the researcher had written in their statement. Overall, then we checked about 1,000 records by eye, and then we identified case studies, which we cross-referenced across providers to identify the common successes and issues. So overall, although there were very high extraction rates for data availability statements, I think it was something like 80 to 90% odd. So there's definitely the extraction from getting the data back is definitely improved. The kind of the correct categorization, why did I put that in there, was mid to low. So as you can see on the slide, the highest accuracy rating from solution provider 1 was 51%, but they only returned a data set of their own published articles that they'd found data set for. So even using their own metadata and their own tools, they only achieved a 1% higher accuracy rating than solution provider 3, whose data set included articles from a range of different publishers. The machine readability, also the access conditions, we found was quite poor. So looking at published access restricted data sets on our own repository, 77% of those were categorized as on request from author, as the algorithm couldn't detect the difference between on request from author to on request from a repository. Also, the kind of obvious thing, categorizing the openness of a statement is of course not measuring the data itself. This meant the statements with multiple or complex data sets cited were either incorrectly categorized or the categorization was too simple. Also, the specifications didn't take into account that kind of disparity across disciplines. So like, for example, complex cohort data studies, archives, museums, who already have maybe a set citation or request practices, and their infrastructure is not going to match a commercial research data repository, which has DOI and things like that. We found that if we don't accommodate the current practices, we could risk certain disciplines then being measured unfairly within the current criteria. So ultimately, in this case, we felt we were unable to provide an accurate, transparent, ethical indicator for the openness of data. The methodology of using the DAS as a central point analysis was flawed. However, we were kind of restricted to that access point and linkage point to actually that starting point of where to find the data itself. But essentially we can't use a quantitative tool to measure something that acts as qualitative data without controlled language. However, we think the underlying issues are a bit more complex than enhancing the algorithms themselves that underpin the data. So improving the visibility of data sets within publications, we think it requires collaborative work by funders, publishers, institutions, and researchers to standardize the language, templates, and distinctions of what constitutes data. And then we can have a more solid baseline with which to start assessing the openness of data. Until that collaborative work is undertaken, we think improvements in machine learning are inevitably going to have a gap between what can be read by eye and what can be detected through those use of tools. So it's merely going to show an improvement in detection rates rather than a measurement or increase of the openness of data itself. Essentially, overall, then we thought that the current infrastructure and academic publication environment, there is no machine answer without human input and also a change in the research culture itself. And yeah, that is it for me. Many thanks for listening. And I think I'm passing it back to Dolly now.
Thanks, Dolly. I'll just share my screen. So hopefully everyone can see that now. Yep, great. Okay, so I'll make a start. Hello, everyone. I'm Amanda Boll, Head of Library Research Services at Newcastle University, and we were one of the lead institutions for Open Research Indicator Pilot 7, which was investigating the use of credit taxonomy in research outputs. I'm going to talk briefly about what we hope to achieve with the pilot study, how we approached it, and a summary of our findings. And we very nearly completed the final report, which obviously covers this in more detail than I'm going to go into today. So just, I probably don't need to say this to this audience, but just a quick reminder of credit and its benefits. Credit taxonomy was introduced in 2015, and journals and publishers have increasingly required authors to use credit in contributor statements. It's a structured vocabulary for contributions beyond simple authorship lists, and its use can encourage and facilitate early discussions between authors regarding contributions, which may help to avoid and reduce the number of authorship disputes. It can enhance reproducibility and transparency by explicitly defining contributions, making it easier to trace who is responsible for specific aspects of the study. And research institutions are interested in credit within the context of the contribution to knowledge and understanding and the people, culture, and environment elements of REF, as a way of systematically documenting contributions from authors, as well as other contributors who may not have met the authorship criteria. So for all those reasons, and I'm sure there are many more, institutions who are fostering a good research culture should encourage use of credit. So as part of the UKRN Open Research Indicators projects, this pilot was originally conceived as 2 separate pilots, and institutions interested in exploring this topic came together to discuss what we hoped we could achieve as a measure of credit. After initial meetings took place, we decided to merge into one pilot group as there was so much overlap in shared data that it made sense to do this. And within our pilot, we agreed what information we would ask the suppliers to provide. And this was, one, whether each output contained a statement of author contributions, coded as a binary yes versus no for existence of the statement. Also an indicator of discipline based on the journal and the year of publication. In addition to that, and this was originally, I think, what Pilot 8 was going to be, was what roles are populated in each statement and how those roles are spread across disciplines. So we weren't just interested in sort of reporting on credit, it was delving a little bit deeper into how credit was being used. So we had initial few meetings, including the lead institutions of what was Pilot 7 and 8, but soon to become just Pilot 7. And the lead institutions were King's College London, Universities of Leeds, Newcastle, and Glasgow. All pilot institutions were invited to participate in the study, and those who did were Liverpool, Surrey, Exeter, and Reading. And we then put out a call to solution providers to engage with us, and those who responded were Open Air, Digital Science, PLOS, and Elsevier. We met with PLOS, but mutually agreed not to work on Pilot 7 any further with them, as we were aiming for a wider breadth of publications than those published by just one provider. And after separate meetings with Elsevier, Digital Science and Open Air, we agreed we would work with them on this project. The green X next to Elsevier indicates that although they were engaged and quick to come back to us with some results, their dataset was limited to Science Direct publications. And so again, although extensive, not the publisher breadth we were aiming for, and they were unable to analyse our institutional data, which included publications beyond Science Direct. Therefore, it was Digital Science and Open Air who we sort of fully engaged with as part of this as pilot. So our methodology, so we've just sort of briefly, because we do have limited time, that the partner institutions exported publication data with a common set of fields from our institutional repository or CRISs and uploaded them to a Figshare folder. The criteria for the data set was that the publication must be open access, published in 2023, and an article type only. Then Figshare access was given to the providers, and they had the questions we wanted answers to from our previous meetings, and we waited for them to come back with the results. When the providers had findings to share, we met with them again separately to talk through their processes and their results, and the providers then shared their resulting files with us for evaluation. For the evaluation, each institution hand-checked a sample of the results against the actual contributor statements in the papers themselves to estimate accuracy of the algorithms used. We had follow-up meetings with the providers to discuss our findings, and both providers were keen to use that information to improve the accuracy of the analysis. So for hand-checking, we were, as I think Mark mentioned, quite sort of rigid in what we were looking for, and we had quite a bit of discussion about what we would actually check. And it was sort of two elements to it. It was simply, was a contributor statement present, yes or no, true or false, and was it correctly identified by the algorithm? And then, was credit statement present, yes or no, and was it correctly identified by the algorithm? So our findings, the supply algorithm showed a high level of accuracy in correctly identifying when no contributor statement was present, including no credit statement. And across both providers, the accuracy for that exceeded 94%. The OpenAir algorithm correctly identified contributor statement present in 93% of papers, and the digital science algorithm correctly identified in 60% of papers. However, we've discussed that and with them, and digital science have already identified where this percentage can be improved. The accuracy checking for identifying if a credit statement was present was higher in the OpenAir dataset than the digital science dataset, and the percentages are there. But again, that has been shared with suppliers, and they're looking at how that can be improved. So conclusions, credit's a highly controlled taxonomy, and if used correctly, it allows for easy identification of roles. However, the pilot found that there were large variations in how contributor and credit statements are written. Common issues we found were individual credit roles used in contribution statements by coincidence rather than intentional use of the taxonomy, resulting in a false positive. Credit roles were used consistently within statements, but written in a narrative format, not using exact roles or using different tenses. So X conceptualized the study rather than conceptualization, or supervisor was rather than supervision. There were spelling differences.
A bit of air.
Sorry. And there were line breaks within the contribution statements, which meant latter sections were not picked up by the text mining. So there's some formatting problems there that made it difficult to sort of extract that data. So some of the challenges, I think time's probably been mentioned, was Neil at the beginning mentioned some of the pilots. The partners were all taking part in the study voluntarily, the institutions and the providers. And personally, I found that I would like to give more time to this. So that was a big challenge. We found we were unable to investigate discipline differences further. I think we were ambitious Again, that's been mentioned in some of the other pilots. When we started, we were keen to look at that. And when we extracted our data sets, we included institutional, school or department information associated with the paper. We hope to do further analysis on that, but we didn't have the time. However, I know that is an area that the providers are keen to look at as well. Commercial partners, so as part of a wider discussion across all the pilot partners at the very beginning of the process, we were aware that we could be working with some commercial partners, maybe working with them to develop indicators that then they charge us to access. So that is a risk. However, it's somewhat mitigated by working with non-commercial partners too. Elsevier, it was unfortunate that we weren't able to engage with them further, as they have a rich data set of publications data, but limited to Science Direct in this instance. And one of the challenges was just the variation of terms used that make text mining difficult, and that is the very thing that credit should be helped to avoid. So the next steps and recommendations are that stakeholders should collaborate to create and adopt an open machine-readable metadata schema for recording and displaying credit rolls. Benefits include increased usage for authors due to ease of use, reduced errors in identifying credit rolls, and the opportunity for institutions to monitor usage. If automated, this monitoring would have low cost and low administrative burden. We'd also like to identify publishers from the pilot dataset that do not use credit taxonomy and engage these publishers in conversations to increase adoption. Work should be undertaken to automatically match extracted credit rolls to individual contributors. This automation could feed into individual researchers' profiles, providing a granular overview of their contributions to research. Institutions should consider updating wording of documents, policies, and systems to include use of contributor alongside author. And UKRN and institutions should carry out advocacy and engagement activities to raise awareness of credit and increase its usage. And that's it from me. So I'll stop sharing. And I think I am passing over to Etienne now.
So my name is Etienne Roesch. I am a professor of applied statistics and cognitive science at the University of Reading. I was co-leading Pilot 3 with Alice Haworth from the University of Liverpool, and we worked also with Valerie, and I'm not going to butcher her name, at the University of Glasgow. We worked with digital science, Elsevier, plus DataSeer and OpenAir I think what was perhaps the most exploratory of the pilots, because we were not just counting things, or it was a bit more research and development. Our aim was to develop an indicator that would allow us to measure the downstream effects of sharing data. And by that, we mean we wanted to we wanted to go beyond just the number of citations of things, and we wanted to get a qualitative impression of the downstream effect of sharing data. Very early on during the pilot, we discussed these roadmaps that I displayed here, which are we had clearly 4 phases to sort of structure our development. First, we looked at what information do we want, what information do we already have about research output from universities, what other sources can we use. We wanted them to be able to produce some metrics of some sort, or some information that can be used then to put combined into a structured narrative. So we wanted to move away from simply producing numbers, and we wanted to be able to produce a richer indicator. It looks like the development was very linear and very planned, and it worked really fine, but we really had a more agile method of development, back and forth, discussing scopes, and it was, I think, all in all, quite a rich experience to just put this together and for us institutions, I think part of the learning process was a big results. We learned what data was available to us, how we could work together, and that in itself was quite a nice experience. So what did we care about? We basically, as institutions, we wanted to be able to produce a narrative about research output or data and data reuse, but there were certain features that we were interested in, such as who is citing our work, how has this impact evolved over time, is there a timeline of jumps, for example, in between disciplines, and I put it in bold because this is the example I will follow throughout my presentation. Are there correlations with other things that we do, such as policies that we deploy in universities? And so we wanted to be able to see the unfolding of this impact over time. So in order to do that, we produced citation graphs that take a DOI or either from a paper or from a data set, and then we produced the citation graph. So in this example, you see in the middle one of my papers, and then the papers that cite my paper, and then the papers that cite my paper. And in color, you will see the discipline that is sort of self-assigned to each of the papers. And what is interesting in this example is that my paper was published in psychology, but you can see that the impact has evolved into a different discipline. In this case, it's affective computing and computer science. So I could produce a narrative about my own output and the impact that I've had into different disciplines. I want to point out at this stage that this is a paper, it's not a data set. We've realized that actually focusing only on the data set can be a bit difficult because data sets do not necessarily have a DOI. They don't necessarily, they are not easily identifiable in the databases that we have, but and so I will speak about this at the end of my presentation. So we use these graphs to produce sort of graph theoretic metrics. What you can see from this particular representation is that the data itself that we have access to from databases isn't necessarily very clean. And so in this case, there are true positives or false positives about the citations, because in the databases that exist, the citations don't necessarily match up. And so in this case, I've identified someone who didn't cite me, but still is linked into these databases. So that is a big point of challenge, I think. This is a larger example for a data set, I think from the University of Bristol. And so the data set looks at some genetic, it's a genetic-based data set, and you can see that there are actually citations in the field of psychology, and so we can actually create a very interesting narrative about the downstream impact of that specific data sets for disciplines, which I quite find interesting. And just to point out one result from one of the providers, I'm not going to name names because that's a bit unfair, because other providers have produced things that are equally interesting. But one of the providers used these graphs to produce an automated narrative about these downstream impacts. And so about that specific data set, they identified the key papers that use that data set and then produced a qualitative description of this downstream impact, which I find quite interesting in itself. So we wanted to address what we felt was a persistent gap in research evaluation by looking at the downstream effect of research output. What we realized is that institutions that our work was based on the data sets and the data that is available from institutions and open and other databases. But the way that institutions manage data repositories vary a lot. Some institutions do not necessarily have an open repository of data sets, or and actually it makes sense. Sometimes they advise researchers not to use an institutional data set repository, but to prefer discipline-specific repositories because they are curated by people who know about the data being managed. And so there are quite a bit of discrepancies that need to be managed, and so that creates challenges for someone who wants to identify indicators. We also realized that in order to produce these things, I'm a software engineer by training, so it was a bit easier for me to manipulate these graphs and so on. But it does take a significant amount of expertise in to be able to produce these things. But it's not impossible. Automated ways of doing it are completely possible, but they have their own share of challenges. And obviously, we used a lot of LLMs as well. And so I'm pretty sure that the providers will come up with new techniques and new products very soon. In my head, quantitative is hopefully dead because I don't think this is very helpful. And I think, but the alternative would be to use quantitative metrics alongside qualitative narratives. And I think this is the results from the pilot is definitely showing that this is possible. What we're going to be moving forward is, the report already contains quite a bit of information. Hopefully, we'll finish it very soon. And it will describe the steps and more results of what we did. We will be releasing some of the code and data, but a lot of this, a lot of the data that we used remains proprietary from the providers, so it will be up to them to share this. Because so we also worked with or engaged with data sets like Overton, for example, to be able to complement the data that we had access to link to the grey literature, for example. But because of the UKRN's commitment to using open data, because we signed the Barcelona Declaration to using open data, we engaged quite a bit with OpenAlex, and we decided that, and so a few ideas and a few people were interested in this, and so we are now collaborating with JISC to curate OpenAlex and hopefully to be able to provide this data to other people. We are also engaging with institutions who said that they were interested in carrying on this work, and also the providers who have already said that they thought this was a very useful exercise to them. And with that, I am passing the baton to someone else, but I'm not quite sure who.
Thanks, Etienne. So our final speaker is Mick Eadie, and then we'll move on to a brief Q&A.
Okay, can everyone see my screen now?
Yep, all good.
Brilliant, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Mick Eadie from the University of Glasgow, and I'm going to be talking about the final pilot this afternoon. It was pilot 4, looking at the prevalence and quality of data availability statements. Our pilot, again, like everyone else, was a big collaboration. So it was a University of Glasgow and Radek and Lorraine from University of Leicester who helped to lead the pilot. And our project suppliers, like a lot of the other projects, were Digital Science, PLOS, DataSeer, OpenEar and Elsevier. And we also had input from a lot of other institutions. So our partner institutions were Edinburgh, Exeter, Bristol, Leeds, Manchester, Surrey, Sheffield, Reading and Newcastle. So I think that's everyone. So the kind of general aim of our project was to see how DAS could be used as a robust indicator for good open research practice. And by doing that, we wanted to look at the prevalence, so kind of count just now how many of the outputs in a given data set actually had a DAS. But that only took us obviously so far. So if we're looking at actually using these in a kind of meaningful way, a binary yes or no doesn't really tell us very much. So we have to, like was already mentioned in the FAIR pilot and in the openness of data pilot, we have to find a way to meaningfully categorise and look at the quality of these DAS before we can actually say we can use them as a meaningful indicator of good practice. So the method that we used, and again, it's very similar to some of the other pilots, we asked our partner institutions to supply an export of articles from exported from their repositories or CRIS systems published in 2023. And we went for the year 2023 because we were trying to get the last full year of kind of recent practice so that we're up to date at that point in time. And we also tried to include only items that were open access in some form, because we felt that would give the automated tools that our project suppliers were going to use a better chance of actually finding and being able to use the right document in order to analyse it. And further to that, we wrote a specification, and I'm hoping that my colleague Radek is putting in the chat a link to our specification. So I'm not going to actually, at this point, spend the time going through it. But essentially, we wrote what we consider kind of 9 elements that would be useful to have in a DAS. And this gave us something that we could then benchmark some of the suppliers' returns against in order to kind of meaningfully categorise sort of quality of the DAS that we found. So as I said, with these data sets that were the suppliers returned to us, identifying the prevalence, so which outputs contained the DAS, and then categorised, basically using the project specification as far as possible, but also using the categorisation that they already use themselves. So it's probably worth saying that a lot of our suppliers have quite mature tools already that could find DAS in research outputs. So it's kind of a big part of our project was looking at how they did it already and some of the kind of methods that they used and some of the terminology they used to categorise and then kind of harmonise that, which was pretty successful. In terms of categorisation, well, I think at kind of high level it was actually quite easy to kind of map across everything. Where the nuances came in and where the further work is probably required, already it's been highlighted by some of the other pilots, is around kind of on request, contact the author, which data sets potentially don't have data because they never produced data. So some of the kind of categorisation of those types of findings probably need a bit more work, but generally things like is it in supplementary data, is it in a repository, etc. These things were fairly easy to categorise. So, and again, Radek, I hope, has put in the chat a link to our classification. This is a kind of working document, but this is what we sort of gleaned from the data in terms of categorising against our specification, looking at what the suppliers returned in terms of categories for DAS, and seeing where the harmony was, seeing how they could map across, and give us a kind of useful kind of starting point, really, to think how we're going to actually implement some of this in the kind of real world. In terms of the prevalence, so just to start that top question there, I mean, I think generally there was nothing too surprising. We were expecting to find that across the piece for 2023, there'd be something like 40 to 50% of outputs had a DAS of some form. And that sort of was what was returned by most of the suppliers' algorithms. We have a report that we're currently just finalising where we will kind of share some of the underlying data when we looked at that. we tried to then, once we had those returns and once we had those kind of numbers, look at how we compared those against kind of manual checks that had been carried out at our university. So what we did was we took a subset, like a lot of the other pilots have done. We compared the supplier's check against a manual check, and there was quite a high level of correlation. Again, there'll be some data to share around that, but I think one thing we did find that was quite noticeable was the suppliers were using DOIs to target documents, and a lot of our manual checking in the repository, certainly for green open access things, was looking at author accepted manuscripts. So what tended to happen was the suppliers would find more statements than we found manually, simply because at the accepted manuscript stage, the author hadn't actually put the statement in yet. They'd obviously been asked to do it by the publisher later on. So that was quite a big discrepancy. And perhaps there's kind of work to do there to provide greater advice and guidance on authors on how to actually add those statements in at an earlier part in the publishing cycle. That was probably one thing that was quite good to highlight. So I've already mentioned the classifications and how we actually correlated that. And again, that document that Radek has shared gives a bit more information on that. So I guess the third question there is, can we classify DAS in a standard way? I think probably we can. And I think probably a lot of the tools, perhaps with a little bit more tweaking, are fairly mature and capable of doing that at quite a high level. So I guess the conversation now is, where do the nuances exist, where the tweaks might need to be made? And I know that a lot of the suppliers have been tweaking their algorithms and their kind of models as they've been going through the project. And can our findings inform institutional practice? Well, I think it certainly can in our case. So at the university, we're already, so currently we do manual checks, and I know a few of the other partners do the same for items that are in our repository, but it's quite a binary yes or no. Is there a statement, is it not? The only extra piece of information we have there is there a data statement? And yes, there is, but there's no data. So we do capture that as well. But I think using this classification, I think it'd be fairly easy for us to start to add categories in there, what type of statement it is, which then will help to kind of grow best practice, I think, and around the kind of sector generally. Certainly at our institution, we can kind of carry on doing that sort of work already. In terms of next steps, we've already started disseminating some of this at various events that we're attending. We've also produced a discussion document, which we're hoping to kind of, we've already sent to UKRN and a few other people to try and lobby stakeholders to continue the conversation around this. I mentioned our local drive to encourage good use and perhaps beef up how we actually record this kind of stuff just now. Looking maybe for funding to help support some of this work. But I think generally on that, keeping the conversation going, I think one of the huge successes of our pilot and probably all the other ones is just having the space to have that conversation with our suppliers and the different institutions that were involved has actually been really valuable in helping to kind of unpick some of this. So we found that really beneficial, I think. And also as a kind of, just the last point here, there's been a little bit of interest at our institution to maybe start looking at how we actually build our own tool. Looking at some of the algorithms and some of the language models that might help that. And if there was some way that the sector could club together to produce something a bit more open source that could be reused, that might be quite a successful outcome as well.